Hi everyone, this is Catherine. As I mentioned during last night's class, I'm making a video tutorial to cover everything that was discussed on campus for those of you who may not have been able to follow along, just want some reference, or of course have been dying for the ability to pause me in order to review something that I went over a bit too quickly. So to get right into it, before we get into the subject of conflicts, there were two things I wanted to mention regarding the dictionary. I called it exploring the dictionary. Those 2 points are, one, that many words, maybe not all of them, within your dictionary have very useful dictionary definitions within them. For example, I'll show you one that I find would be quite useful. When you're inside the dictionary, if you are in hyperkeys, which pretty much I suggest you are always in hyperkeys unless you're typing, press F to bring up the Find Dictionary entries. In the text, I'm going to put in the word effect. This is a pretty common word for people to admittedly mess up. Double-click it to bring up the Entry Properties window. Down here, you'll see it says Definition, and indeed, there is a straightforward dictionary definition of the likes you would find either on Merriam-Webster.com or even in a hard copy book. Scrolling down, it will remind you that it is a noun, and then later on, indeed, it is a verb, to bring about, to cause, etc. So, in case you don't have a hard copy dictionary on hand, know that you have one right inside of your program. The other thing I wanted to discuss is that I pitched this as an idea of how you can analyze your writing in the interest of shortening it. How you could do that is, again, by pressing F to bring up this window, and now on the left-hand column, scroll on down to find 3 strokes. This is going to, if you press OK, list all of your entries that use 3 strokes. I'm going to go along to this column, which is a hashtag, which signifies the number of times that you have used that entry. As you can see, the very top one is 153 times I have written "did you know" in 3 strokes. Well, this is certainly an indication that this word or phrase is coming up so often. Isn't it worth my time that I should find a shorter way to write it? I have actually since then. Same with I believe so, he wanted, etc., etc., etc. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make about the dictionary itself. Moving on to conflicts. If you were here last night, then you'll know that I embrace conflicts, and I feel that the AI or artificial intelligence of our CAT software have made it that we don't have to avoid using them, and in fact, they can be very beneficial. 4 ways that I find them to be very useful is that they can do the work for you of including proper capitalization or number conversion. They can help to resolve some stacking issues that you might have. They can include punctuation automatically without your having to worry about it. And sometimes they're not that bad if you just can't think of a new stroke for that brief or that word or phrase you want to write. Talking about the first point, they can help with proper capitalization and numbers in the instance of, let's say, the word exhibit. Now, we'll have a sample sentence where he says, look at the exhibit on the table. Everything will show up very fine. That's great. But maybe he'll say something like, please look at exhibit 3. There you go. Eclipse has automatically capitalized the word exhibit by choosing it from the conflicts, as well as converting the following number correctly. Again, conflicts can help with solving some stacking issues. If you're like most people, you might have a tendency to stack your final ed ending with the next word of to. For example, in the statement of, let's see, I wanted to give him a look. Okay, that resolves quite well. And it would overlap, it's conflicting with the word today. Again, T-O-D. You could simply say, I went to the beach today. Oh, God damn it, that didn't work out. Okay, well, you know what? You have to teach it correctly. We'll get into that. So don't look at that too closely. As I mentioned, smart punctuation. You don't have to worry about inputting the commas specifically around things such as direct nouns of address, which I find to be very useful, because Eclipse will do it for you. An example of that very quickly is, let's see, he says, Your Honor, I would like to, whoops, that's not good. Okay. Yeah, I probably should say, please obviously forgive any typos that happen. Your Honor, I would like to give you a smile. Oh, look at that. I didn't even have to put in the comma because Your Honor appeared at the start of a sentence, and the AI of Eclipse figured out that it's going to want a comma. Same thing if he ends a sentence of, let's say, would you please look at that, Your Honor? Oh, or look at it, whatever. Oh, perfecto. Comma appeared really well. And lastly, like I said, sometimes you can't figure out a separate brief for a word. Recently, the word illicit and illicit came up so many times, and LIS on the keyboard was what I thought would apply to both of them. And so I defined them both. I actually haven't even trained much of this conflict, so we're going to get into that later. So I'm not sure how many of you use conflicts, but if you go back to your dictionary by pressing Control-Tab to simply toggle on over, one way that you can list all of your conflicts for easy viewing is, again, in Hyperkeys, press F to bring up this Find Entries window. On the right-hand side column, scroll down to Conflicts. Press OK, and it will list them all. Now it's going to list it by frequency that I type them, because that's how I have it written down. But anyway, you can see that I have just over 100 conflicts. Some of them I use quite often. Some of them not very much at all. I may have made them, but actually never even used them. Maybe they're new. What's important here is I want to show you the AI, or Artificial Intelligence column. This will show you a number that represents how many AI rules Eclipse has learned. If you click on any entry, this, again, entry properties window pops up. But you're going to look down at the AI data context of 48. That means 48 rules. What are these rules, you ask? Let's take a look. Press on Advanced, and this window pops up. I can understand it looks pretty overwhelming, and even for myself, it's sometimes hard to understand. But this is basically the layout for rules that Eclipse is learning in order to choose which choice of conflict is correct in any given situation. For example, if it's a form of be, it should choose about. It's followed by a preposition. This is the flow of the sentence. This isn't too important to worry about. You simply might want to understand why it does this. If you're very well versed in how this works, I would suggest that you press Add, and then you can manually put in all the different parts of grammar, whether it's an article, verb, etc., or maybe even the start and end of a sentence, and then manually do it that way. That's quite cumbersome. We're going to be discussing a different way to do it. So when it comes to training conflicts, the way that I suggest you do it is that you can simply write out sentences in a transcript in real time using that new conflict in order to teach it rules. We're going to use the example of the illicit and illicit rule. Illicit and illicit, because it recently came up and I haven't taught it anything yet. So if we were to see it in the dictionary, the AI would be 0. Let's do some sample sentences that uses this word. For example, he elicited the drugs from her. Well, okay, or drugs, whatever. If I click on it, there are several ways I can make my selection. When you have it selected with your cursor, you can either right-click and see a drop-down menu of your choices. Just so you know, conflicts don't have to just be 2. They could be 3, 4. That's mostly the maximum I've seen. There's no limit to how many conflicts you can have. Another way you can make your selection is by looking up at the info bar on the left-hand side. 1 would choose option 1 of illicit, and 2 would be illicit. It's also down here in the corner, very, very tiny, and for some reason it's over here. Whatever. Let's see. He elicited the drugs. Boom. Let's take a quick look at my dictionary and see how that... Oh, look at that. I have one little rule. What is the rule, I wonder? Well, if there's a pronoun of he, and then on the other side is a verb, what is it? Elicited. Well, yes, that's a verb. Not really sure what it is. The proper one is elicit as a verb. Let's go back and train it some more. Okay, I like the illicit drugs. Oops, or I like them. It's okay. Eclipse only has one rule, so it's choosing incorrectly. I'm going to manually type 2 on my keyboard to select the correct one, and so on and so forth. It's really not that difficult to do. Maybe it's about 5 or 10 minutes if you're very involved, where you can come up with sample sentences that specifically try to challenge Eclipse's understanding of the grammar in the sentence, making it really obvious, for example, if it's going to be an adjective before a noun, if it's going to be a verb after a pronoun, etc., etc. I'd like to make mention that not all conflicts are created equally. You have to think consciously before you choose what words you're going to have in a conflict. In the illicit and illicit situation, I think it's a very good conflict because one is a verb and one is an adjective, and they occupy very different places in the sentence structure grammatically. It might not be a very good idea at all if you wanted to have a conflict that, say, were both nouns, because how on earth could Eclipse ever know to choose one or the other when they both make sense in a sentence? So that's something you want to consider when you're making when you're making conflicts. Moving on, let's talk about how conflicts are displayed. I've been kind of going on about it without really explaining it, but we're going to talk about how it is displayed in your transcripts. And in order to do that, let's take a look at inside of user settings, going over to the display column. From here, you can select on color selections and see these 3 that apply when talking about conflicts. Conflicts not yet selected, which you can see here in the background. Conflicts selected by the computer. As you may recall, that was when Eclipse tried to guess as to which conflict was correct. And then conflicts selected by the user. It's dark forest green, and that's what it changed to when I made the manual selection. It's very useful for the conflict to come out in a very bright color when it's unresolved, because heaven forbid you let that pass without taking a look at it. While we're on the subject of display, or something related to that, if you're inside user settings and you go over to translate, it might be in your best interest to eventually select this. Pick first conflict choice by default. Pretty self-explanatory, but what that means is that instead of showing the backslash and all that syntax involved in the conflict, Eclipse will automatically select or pick, but mostly just display the first option. This is very useful if you were to say, doing some captioning and you can't risk having a whole long string, especially when they get really long with all that punctuation syntax appearing on screen, either for your viewers on television or for your student next to you. Or you might also be doing a real-time test where it's just too risky. You don't want to have too many points taken off. I actually have only recently embraced this, but I find it to be very useful. It makes everything look really good. So that's one thing I wanted to say about the pick first conflict by default. And don't worry, it's not that Eclipse is then making a selection and learning off of the grammar or anything like that. It's just saving you some time and space. The last bit I wanted to get into is to take a closer look at the syntax involved in some of the more quote-unquote complex conflicts. I already mentioned some of them, so let's look back into our dictionary, and I'm going to bring up a few that you might find very useful yourself. For example, the word exhibit. Actually, no, I'm going to do page. Okay. As with, actually, let me make this even larger. As with the example of exhibit in regards to whether or not it's going to be normal, lowercase or capitalized with a number after it, this is the syntax that you're going to be using. Page is the same way. Please look at the page, or page 12 of the document states blah, blah, blah. All syntax for conflicts include this: a backslash, your first choice, whatever it is, and another backslash to separate it. This can go on and on, as I mentioned, but here we just have 2 choices. You would then have the capitalized option followed by this pretty little trigger, squiggly bracket, hashtag G, and end squiggly bracket, G standing for generic, which we can get into later, but essentially means that it will trigger any numbers that are written after this word to become a digit, which is very useful. So you can take a second to put pause and use this for other such entries as exhibit with this syntax, or table, such like, look at table 15 in the document. That can also be useful. Tape, or eventually street. I don't do that myself, but it's a very, very good thing to do as well. Street too, etc., etc. And this very last part is to show how you can use direct nouns of address with surrounding punctuation and have Eclipse choose it correctly.